I think we can go ahead and get started. We'd like to invite Sister Germaine up. Sister Germaine has been instrumental with Sister Joetta, both of them, in helping us identify the 8 patron saints for our handmaid congregation. And so we're taking the opportunity to have Sister begin the talk with a prayer that she authored, dedicated to the patron saints of the community. And we would like you to kind of reverently listen to the prayer and allow Sister to share what she's written. Sister Germaine.
Thank you, Judy. Good morning to you all.
Good morning.
We will just take a small break to begin our day with a prayer. A prayer that addresses our patron saints, the patron saints that we see up here. O holy patrons, models for us all, even in times of trials and desolation, accompany us along the path of life, that with open hearts and deepening faith, we rejoice always in the gifts and graces of God's love. Help us to respond to the plan of God each new day with appreciation and gratitude. Amen.
Amen.
Now I might just say a word about patron saints. These patron saints displayed up here are saints that were chosen by our leadership over the years as patron saints of the congregation. Now, just why those particular saints? Because basically they are models for us, and they exemplify the charism that is part of our congregation. Saint Katharina Casper had a wonderful feel for the poor, for the sick, for the outcast, for the marginalized people. And each of these saints, in their own way, exemplify that. And we try to imitate them. They're good for all of us, not just for us, but for you too. Have a wonderful time here.
Thank you, Sister. We appreciate your fine work in offering the prayer that's on the packet. I'm going to say just a little bit about David. I don't know too much about his professional background, academic background, although he did give me his resume. David's a cousin of a very lifelong friend of mine. And she said, you need to work with David several times because David's really an artist par excellence. He works with the Archdiocese of Chicago. He works in stained glass. He works in mosaics. And then he's recently just began this whole series of everyday saints. And when we put them up in the reception area, outside the reception area in the Heritage Room, some of the comments were that these pictures make me happy when I look at them. The colors are beautiful. They enliven us. And those are comments that we like to hear because some people say, well, what are they? They look a little bit like modern day icons. They look a little bit like, someone said, cartoons, but they're not. They're inspirational. They have points in each of them that you can identify related to each of the significant saints. And David is a professional in drawing that out. I have a favorite, St. Peter, over in the Heritage Room, and St. George, which you'll see later. But these two are wonderfully done, and they are outstanding. St. Francis, for one, too, is another one of my favorites there. And that's nice for us because we're now affiliated with the Marian College is now affiliated with us, I guess I should say. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn this over to David, the artist, and if there's any questions and any comments, and you have the opportunity to join us, please do so. And we look forward to sharing what David has done so beautifully for us. David?
Thanks. Good morning, and I am delighted to be here. And this morning I was introduced by Sister Germaine as being one of their kids. And I grew up in Hammond, Indiana. And the sisters of the Poor Handmaids were the educators in all the Catholic schools in Northwest Indiana. I started out my parents went to Catholic school. They were immigrant children. My father's father was from Hungary. When they came to the United States, they moved to the Hungarian ghetto in Indiana Harbor. So he went to the Hungarian Catholic school, and my mother was Polish, went to Immaculate Conception in East Chicago, Indiana. And Immaculate Conception was a really interesting church because it was the priest was from Italy, Father Campagna, who started Hoosier Boys Town. But when they were building the church for mostly a Polish and Italian community in East Chicago, Indiana, he saw them tearing up the streets, which had all this great old paving brick. So he collected all the paving brick. He designed a Romanesque Italianate church that the bricklayers of the neighborhood built. And when I was a child, I was born at St. Margaret's Hospital, and then I was baptized by Father Campagna. And so this is part of a big arc. We'll talk about him a little bit later. So I went to, when they were building the church in my neighborhood, St. Catherine of Siena, it was a new neighborhood, it was a new church. The school wasn't finished yet, so for first and second grade, I was put on a bus with all the other neighborhood kids, and we went to St. Joseph Elementary. But it was it was the height of the baby boom. I was born in 1957, and that was the biggest year for children. And there were a lot of Catholic children. So I was in this class, there was an overflow of, it seemed like it was 40 to 50 kids. And as kind as the nuns were, we were sort of treated as the red-headed stepchildren because it wasn't our parish, even though we were welcome. But I was struggling, and also I was dyslexic. Back then, if you were slow at reading or you mixed numbers or you mixed your alphabet, there wasn't a word for it yet. I didn't find out that it had a name until I got to art school and said, oh, you're dyslexic like me. And then I found out that lots of great people are dyslexic, including Barack Obama, and I'm also left-handed, and he's left-handed. So I went there for first and second grade, and then I was just drowning there. And my parents thought, why are we spending this money on private school when he can go to public school for free? And so for third grade, I went to public school, and then I just bloomed as a student and did really well all through public school. But I think being taken out of that intense, amazing spiritual environment of St. Joe's just sort of stuck with me as something that was always in the back of my mind that I would always be visiting and revisiting. So I went to an art school in Cleveland, the Cleveland Institute of Art, which sort of modeled on the Bauhaus from Germany, which taught artists that you had to be knowledgeable in every field, from sculpture to applied arts like weaving and textiles, graphics, painting, sculpture. And so the school I went to sort of touched on all of the arts, and you got to dip your toe in every one of the art fields. After school, my dream was to live in Chicago. Chicago was always my New York City. I wanted to work for all the museums in Chicago. I wanted to work for Marshall Fields. Chicago just was the golden gate of opportunity. And when I first got out of school, I was living in my parents' basement, and I went to the Hammond Times, which was the local newspaper, and I begged them to give me assignments. And so one of the first assignments I did was this. And when I went to the Hammond Times, the editor said, look kid, this ain't the New York Times, this is the Hammond Times. We don't hire illustration, we just use photographs. And I said, please, I'll make you a great deal. I'll do 4 illustrations for $100. That's $25 a piece. Take a chance, it's only $25 a piece. So they gave me a story about the state of industry and the steel mills in the Calumet region, which is where I was from. So the reason why I wanted to show you this was that it was an early piece, but every single person in my family except me worked in the steel mills. My dad, my uncles, my aunts, my cousins. For some reason, when I would go apply at Youngstown Steel, they would always say, no, there's no job for you. And my cousin said, you were lucky. It was a horrible place to work. But it was where my parents worked, and all my relatives, but it put food on the table. And my father got up super early to get to the early shift, and we would eat very early. We would eat at, when he would get off work at 3, so we would eat at 4 or 4:30. So we had early meals, but that was the blue collar life. And so when this opportunity came to draw about what was happening in industry, because a lot of it was being shipped overseas, it was going to India, and the steel mills were not the thriving empires that they once were. This was a chance to sort of pay tribute to my family, who had all worked in the steel mills. So to go back to St. Joseph, at St. Joseph, when they built the church, they hired this amazing painter whose name escapes me, but it was a church built for a working class community. Everyone worked in the steel mills except for people who had white collar jobs. But the mural of the altar is the building of the church, and you see the bricklayers and the welders building the church, and you see the architect in his blue suit, and you see the church hierarchy looking at the plans and pointing. And then at the top of the altar is the Holy Family, but depicted as a working family, which always stuck with me. Mary is at the loom, Joseph is at the carpentry bench, and Jesus is sort of tidying up the shavings that his father is making when he's making his work. And that really stuck with me, as I come from this working class community. So when I was in 2nd grade, as a very sensitive and impressionable child, most of the kids were drawing Easter eggs and bunny rabbits. I drew the working class crucifixion. I drew Christ on the cross with welders and people in babushkas, the people that I knew, sort of taking part in the crucifixion. I'm sure the nun, Sister Antonia Marie, just thought, where's this kid coming from? But this kid kept going, and I'm here today. And often in my life I've heard no, but I've just kept going forward and trying to get people to say yes. So coming to Chicago, I worked on amazing, really fun projects that were very, very celebratory. And one of the first things I did as a private project was I kept coming back to my Catholic heritage, and I wanted to do a body of work that was easy to produce, not expensive, so I made these silkscreen black and white prints that looked like woodcuts. But they were about the inner spirituality of each saint. So this is St. Francis, Francis of Assisi. You can see the big holes in his hand for the stigmata. You can see the abstraction of his monk-like tonsure haircut, and it is a reference to a painting by Giotto of St. Francis' Sermon to the Birds. But it represents that Francis was trying to, this picture is about Francis trying to get people to understand, and no one was listening to him except because he was considered to be this nutty guy that not only a handful of people were listening to. So in this image, even the birds aren't listening, they're on his head, but eventually his message was heard, and obviously we love him today as the patron saint of nature. This is Saint Juliana. One thing I noticed when I was studying the lives of the saints is all women, when described as being a saint, are beautiful, and they are breathtaking. And during the early days of Christianity, all of the Roman army were pursuing these women who had said no to marriage or to the seductions of a man, and had chosen a Christian life. And so Saint Juliana was one of those beautiful women, and she was put in prison because she refused to marry in this arranged marriage within the military. And so her father, according to the legend, convinced the devil to come disguised as her guardian angel to talk her into marrying the captain of the guard. And so she said no. She saw through the devil's disguise and said no, and sadly she was martyred. But as you can see, she's this very fierce-looking woman, and no is on her cheek, and you can see the disguised devil as her guardian angel. But her Christianity and her faith is so strong that crosses are flying around it. This is St. Vincent Ferrier, who was a very interesting 15th century saint, who was the first person to think about the idea that maybe Judas wasn't quite so guilty, that it was part of a bigger plan that was just part of the role of Christ's life. That without the part of Judas betraying him and selling him for 40 pieces of silver, we wouldn't have Christianity, we wouldn't have the crucifixion. And so he was this brilliant thinker in the 15th century who said we should give him another chance. So behind him is St. Vincent Ferrer, who was one of the flying saints. He could levitate or fly, so he's always depicted with wings. But he's standing in front of Judas and holding his hands as to say, hold on a second, but also echoing the wings. His hands create the wings around Judas. So it's more about the idea and thinking about the possibility, but these pictures are also about storytelling, which is the lives of the saints are storytelling. This is St. Barbara, who is known as the patroness of architecture. When I was 28, I took a 3-month trip by myself, and I wandered around Europe, and since I grew up at St. Catherine of Siena, and since I was, my confirmation name is Francis, I had to go to Assisi and Siena. So when I was in between both places, I stopped in Florence, which is the heart and the home of the Renaissance. At Santa Croce, one of the big and beautiful churches, there are tombs of famous Italians. And one thing I noticed was that there were a lot of images carved out of stone of women with castles on their heads, like a hat. And what that meant was that person was from a particular town, and everyone would know the building because it was the tallest building in that particular town when the person lived. So that really struck with me. So I drew St. Barbara wearing this castle-like hat, almost like she's a fairy princess. And the story of St. Barbara is that her father kept her locked in a tower to eventually, it was called a bride price, that the family would make money by trading her to another noble family. So she was in this tower, and what happened was he was protecting her virginity, and the workmen came in to put a window in the tower, and she suggested that they put 3 windows in. And because it was a representation of the Holy Trinity. So when the father came back, he was so angry that his daughter did this without permission that he dragged her to the king and told the king that she had to be executed. The king didn't want to do this, but he tried pouring boiling water on her. She was resilient to that. They tried setting her on fire. She was resilient to that. And then the not very bright father took the king's sword and cut his daughter's head off, and then walked up to his castle on the hill, and he was struck dead by lightning. So in the image, she's as if she's in a parade, and behind her is the Renaissance that represents the Renaissance in Florence, but she's walking with this sort of staff, which is a cross, but the lightning travels through the staff and then kills her father. So he's this skeleton. Pretty gritty. And St. Christopher and St. Barbara are one of the 14 holy helpers. And during the 1960s, when a lot of changes were happening in the church, a handful of saints who they could not prove their existence were eliminated from the list of saints. But St. Christopher has always kind of been a patron saint of mine, as well as St. Francis, but to me, he's the patron saint of lifeguards. He's the patron saint of boat safety, water safety. As a kid going to St. Lawrence Catholic camp, we wore St. Christopher medals when we went swimming as protection. But he's always been somebody fascinating to me. And as I looked into his story, I was so taken by the story. Apparently, he was a giant, a very big guy, and he served the king, but then when the king was afraid of the devil, he decided to serve the devil. And then one day, a small child wanted to be carried across the river. Apparently, they hadn't figured out how to make a boat yet. And so he put this boy on his shoulder, and as he was walking through the water, the boy got heavier and heavier and heavier. And it took all of his strength to save this boy's life and his own. And when he got there, he said to this child, "You are really heavy." And then he revealed that it was really the Christ child bearing the weight of the world. And so when Christopher died, his followers apparently cut up his body and planted him and buried him around the world. And this notion of seeing an image of St. Christopher before you go on a trip would protect you. So, especially in a lot of the really old medieval churches in Italy and in France, you see big walls painted to St. Christopher, but depicting this very story. This is a stained glass window that I did for Christmas at the Barack Obama Christmas White House. I designed a chapel in Chicago, and it was meant to be a nature chapel. So there was a competition for chapel design at the new Children's Hospital, and because they serve all kinds of communities, it could only be images of nature. And so when I won the commission, I thought, well, I can have these wonderful trees with birds, but the hospital staff said, no, you can't have animals in it because that wouldn't work with the Muslim faith. You can have images of nature, but you can't have animals or birds. So it wanted to be just being images of trees and water. And it's a fantastic piece. It's longer than this room. It's 8 feet high and about 100 feet long of images of trees and Lake Michigan. The person, when they were opening the hospital, this woman was hired to throw a big gala for the hospital, and she was the one person who got the job to decorate the White House during the Obama administration. So she saw the stained glass windows in the chapel, and she called me up and said, we saw your work, we'd like you to design some Christmas wreaths for the White House. And I thought, well, I looked up what a stained glass Christmas wreath looked like, and I thought, well, you could buy that at Home Depot, you could buy that at Hobby Lobby, but it's not very interesting. And to me, being an American artist is about ingenuity and bringing a sense of symbolism when you can. So I had this idea, what would happen if a Christmas wreath and a snowflake produced something? So they were sort of Christmas wreath snowflake inspired, but this was the welcome window. Back in the colonial period of the United States, the pineapple was the symbol of welcome. And Barack Obama grew up in Hawaii, which is also a pineapple symbol. So I was walking through Macy's and I saw these crystal platters that were $75 marked down to $15. So I bought 30 of them and I thought I'm using them for some sort of a project. And so what I was trying to do was connect the history and the past of crafts with these cut glass crystal platters that suggested another era with my modern way of thinking. So this was one of the round windows for the White House. This is another one. They're 4 feet high. And it was the whole thing, when I got the project, I wanted to use as many American craftsmen as possible and celebrate craftsmanship in the United States. Could I get a glass of water? Anyway, so I did 4 windows. They're 4 feet in diameter. All the various glass pieces came from around the United States. I looked on the computer and I looked up who was making what. These actually were made in they're called rondelles, the round sections with the little bits of color, which is known as marini. Thank you. They were made in Kokomo, Indiana, at Kokomo class. And they really turned out nice. So you can see the size of them. They were made in Riverside, Illinois,